Today is Friday, October 27th, 2006, and we are interviewing Bernadette Miller at the Missouri State University Library. Ms. Miller was born on September 27th, 1948 in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and served as an Army nurse. My name is Nikki Smith, and I will be the interviewer. The camera person is Megan Candlebinder, and also in attendance is Shauna Henson. Ms. Miller, could you please tell us your branch of service, rank, and where you served?
I was in the Army Nurse Corps. I served as a second lieutenant, was later promoted to first lieutenant, and subsequently promoted to captain. And I served at Fort Hood, Texas, Fort Sam Houston, Texas, Fort Hood, Texas, and Vietnam.
Thank you. Were you drafted or did you enlist?
At the time, all women who joined did so of their own free will, just like it is today. We were the original volunteers.
Why did you pick the Army to join?
They offered me the best deal for my education.
Very good. Do you recall your first days of service and like where you landed in Vietnam and what your first thoughts were?
Well, actually, the first days of service, I have to go back to basic training, because basic training was just one of those, I had never really been out of the state of Pennsylvania except for a trip to South Carolina. And to land in Texas in the fall especially at Fort Sam Houston, Texas, where it was hot, 100 and some degrees, and I come from the mountains of Pennsylvania where it's 80. It's just I just couldn't understand how people could live in heat like that. And at that time, none of the buildings at Fort Sam Houston were air conditioned, except for the main hospital. So it was very hot and very uncomfortable, very humid, very uncomfortable.
How did you get through that? Like, how did you manage?
Well, it was only 6 weeks. We knew that at the end of 6 weeks we'd be off to our first duty station, and our instructors would tell us that it's cooler here in Texas than it is in Vietnam, and we should be thankful, and it was much less humid. And everything was so new. There was so much to learn about the military that we really didn't have time to worry about the weather that much. And we just had to get through basic training. Officer basic training is nothing like enlisted basic training, especially at that time. We did no PT. We only marched to and from classes, and we had one formation a day, and that was just to make sure we were all there. We didn't have to live on the post because we were officers, and it was much less regimented than what enlisted people go through.
Cool. Do you remember your first arrival to Vietnam, what it was like, what your first thoughts were?
Well, it was very, very hot, very, very hot, very humid. The stench was unbearable. There's just a stench about Vietnam that every veteran will tell you about, that it's just unbearable. And it was in the middle of the night, and it was just scary. It was very scary. We were on our flight. There were only 2 female nurses, 2 of us women. The rest were all men. I don't know, maybe 200 men on this big plane, you know, and it's just very scary when you come into a country that you know nothing about.
Absolutely. What was your actual job assignment once you arrived in Vietnam?
I was, my MOS was 3448, which meant registered nurse. And basically what I did was take care of the soldiers when they came out of the operating room and they were waking up from their surgery, and we stabilized them and got them ready to be medevaced back to the States if that's where they were going to go. Other soldiers we had to keep there because they could not be stabilized, and maybe some died, and maybe some actually got sent to Cameron Bay, which was a convalescent hospital where soldiers who were not slightly wounded would go there and recuperate and then be sent back out.
What would you say was the hardest part of working in the hospital?
Not being able to save everyone. That would be the hardest part.
And having to deal with the aftermath.
Mm-hmm.
Could you tell us about a couple of your most memorable experiences while you were in Vietnam? Or in the military in general?
One of my patients in the middle of the night, we had what we call a mass cal, which means that it was a mass casualty. There were a large number of patients coming in. This young man had 4 IVs, 1 in each extremity, and they didn't really expect him to live. When I looked at his paperwork, he was from a town not very far from where I grew up. And I don't remember his name. I don't know why, but I just don't. I worked pretty hard at making sure that he made it out of our hospital. Whether or not he made it back to the States alive, I don't know. He eventually was stable enough to be transferred out of our hospital. The first hospital I was at was a field hospital, and it was, we only kept people there we tried to keep them there only 3 days and then send them out. And obviously some people had to stay longer. And so we never really knew if people were healed or if they developed complications, or if they did manage to get back to the States.
Were you awarded any medals or citations?
I received the Army Commendation Medal, which is this medal here. These are miniature medals that we can wear even on our civilian clothes. And actually, as a little aside, you might see a lot of veterans wearing their medals on Veterans Day because we're encouraged to do so.
While you were in Vietnam, how did you, and if you did, stay in touch with your family?
Well, of course, at that time, there wasn't any
no
computers. The phone system was, you couldn't make a direct phone call. I wrote letters to my family, and I used the Army MARS system. Have you ever heard of the MARS system? It's the Military Affiliated Radio System. And the MARS operators used ham radios. Do you know what that is? Okay. Mm-hmm. Used ham radios to contact other ham radio operators in the States, who then placed a phone call to your family for you. And that way you only paid for the amount from, say, California to Pennsylvania. And I talked to my family that way occasionally. But I only found out about that system after I'd been in Vietnam for about almost a year. So it wasn't very well, for us in the hospital, it wasn't very it wasn't just, we just didn't know about it. And when I went on, I had a 7-day leave. I went to Taipei. I met a young man there. I don't know what he did. He worked for the embassy. And he would let me use an embassy phone to call. And the hotel allowed me to make phone calls, and I never got a bill for it. And neither did my parents. We didn't care, because it would have cost probably a small fortune. But that was the only time that it was very difficult. People just didn't just didn't, and we just wrote letters.
Were your parents' letters, did you receive those like regularly, or was it just occasional?
You know, I don't remember, and I couldn't save them because they'd get wet and the ants and the insects would eat them. It is rather disgusting.
Speaking of disgusting, what was the food like? Was it?
Oh, it was just typical military food, Army food. It was just, you'd go in and it was, you know, it'd be powdered eggs for breakfast and bread that was like shoe leather because it was all made there, but because of the way the climate was, you didn't have fresh ingredients, and it was very, it was really kind of bad, I guess. Although one time, and what I remember most was the brown meat at lunch. I'd go through the mess hall line and I'd say to the cook, "Is it liver?" And he'd say no. I don't know if it was or not. It was just a piece of brown meat, and it looked the same every day. There was no difference to it. I don't ever remember having anything other than this brown meat and powdered eggs.
What about your supplies? Like, especially in the hospital, did you feel like you had enough medical supplies, or was it at times short?
The only time that I experienced a shortage of supplies was if we had a premature baby and we needed an incubator. I know you're looking at me strangely. Why would you have a premature baby?
That was going to be my next question.
Just like in today's military, we not only took care of our own soldiers, we took care of the indigent population. And if the Vietnamese hospital had a case where they couldn't handle it because it was too much of an emergency type case, they would send that case to us. And occasionally we'd get a mother who had to have a C-section. And it was usually because they were premature babies, and we needed to have an incubator, and we never had one. And we'd improvise, but we never got one. And it's because we were a field hospital. We were there for soldiers' injuries, and primarily, and we did the native population a favor by taking care of them.
Was that,
as well.
Did you have any other interaction with the native population? Like, were there actual, besides mothers, were there other injuries that came to you also?
Yes, we had, we took care of natives who were injured maybe by the Viet Cong or injured by our troops, and we took care of North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong who had been captured by our troops and who were injured. And every time we had a prisoner on our ward, we had to have a military policeman there to guard them because they were ruthless people. And we got them healed as well as we could, and then they would be medevaced out with to the prison hospital, wherever that was. I think it was in Saigon. And they would be taken care of further there.
So how did you deal with the stress and the pressure of the situation in Vietnam? What was your main outlet like to deal with it?
Well, we made use of adult beverages.
That explains
Do you know what that is?
Yes.
And we had an officers club real close to the hospital, and occasionally we'd have a barbecue there. We'd have steaks. I don't know what kind of meat, but we'd have steak. And we'd have parties and dance. And because the hospital was such a a closed unit. We included the enlisted people, the enlisted men in our parties. And we were invited to other units and where there were parties. But one of the things you probably should know, and maybe you do know this, I don't know, the only women in Vietnam were nurses and donut dollies or Red Cross workers. And there were about 200 office workers in Saigon. The rest of the people where we served, our base camp held 25,000 men, and there were 25 women.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So we had, if we wanted to do anything, we could just about do anything we wanted to do because they bent over backwards to help us and to do things for us. I learned how to rappel. I would go out on helicopter flights.
Oh wow.
Did a whole lot of neat things that normally, especially women at that time, were not permitted to do in the military.
Cool. Where else did you travel during your service besides the main field hospital?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean.
Like, were there other areas in Vietnam except for your one field hospital?
Well, and I did go to 2 other hospitals. I was assigned to 2 others when that hospital closed down. And I would travel to visit friends in other parts of Vietnam, catch a flight and go visit them. And I'd go to Saigon, go to Quy Nhon to visit friends, went to Da Nang to visit friends, went to Chu Lai before I was assigned there to visit friends. And we would fly around to the different LZs, which are landing zones, where there are fire bases. And we'd fly around to those and visit people that we became acquainted with. But of course, we only had 1 day off a week, so this, it wasn't very often that we got to do things like that. And one time I got to go out into the village, and that's where I accumulated a whole lot of things. One of the villages really they were taken with us because I think we were the only American women they'd ever seen. And we had a good time there.
Do you have any photographs you'd like to share?
These are photographs of myself at work, sitting at the desk and preparing medications. And again, that. And then this photograph is at the village that I spoke of. This fellow was the tribal chief, and he wanted me to stay there, which is why I came with lots of gifts. He was giving me gifts, trying to entice me to stay. Okay. And their tribe would make all kinds of weavings, and they have these things we warm around our hair, and those are their blankets and bracelets that they made.
Very cool.
And this is Montyard Village, and they're it's a very primitive village, very, very primitive. I've never seen anything so primitive. They had, the houses were raised on stilts, and they, I never did see the outhouse, so to speak. I remember going into the woods or to the bushes, but it was just very different. Scary in a way, because we knew that outside the perimeter of that village was Viet Cong country, and we really had no business being out there. But we met somebody who said, yeah, I'll take you out to the village, and we got put our hair up underneath our helmets and put our flak jackets on. They gave us some weapons and put us in a truck, and no one knew the difference when we went out the gate.
What would you say was your scariest moment? Was that one of your scarier moments in the military?
No, I think the scariest moment was my first night at this hospital when the rockets started landing, and I was dressed in, you know what baby doll pajamas are? They're shorty pajamas. It's just like a short top and little panties, because no one told me to not dress that way for bedtime. And my chief nurse came to me and she said, throw on your flak jacket and get your helmet and let's go. And she said, by the way, Lieutenant, that's not the way we dress here. Because I had to go to the hospital to help evacuate the patients to the bunker. I had no idea, no one bothered telling me, and I was terrified because those rockets coming over, you could hear them, and you never know if they're going to fall short or if they're going to go where they're supposed to go, and it was very scary, and it didn't let up. It was like every other night we had a rocket attack, and after that first night, I slept in my fatigues. I learned a lesson.
Do you recall the day your service ended and what it was like? Were you excited, upset to leave?
I was very excited. We had come back from Vietnam, and we were out processing at Fort Lewis, Washington, and I had made arrangements to stop and visit some family in Denver on my way back to Pennsylvania. And after I had sat there for 3 days listening to everyone tell me what I have to do to get out of the military, I called my parents and I said, I'm coming straight home. I'm not going to visit family. I need to come straight home. I couldn't wait to get home. It was very, when you come back from a combat zone, it's very kind of scary to come back to the United States. It was really scary. You did not have, there was no one that you could count on back here. I don't know if you can understand that. It's very different.
How did you feel like people received you, especially with the controversy of Vietnam? Did you feel like you were received appreciative or like?
Well, actually, we were very fortunate because our flight came in the middle of the night, and so there was no one in the airport to greet us, good or bad. And when I had to leave 3 days later, when I was going back to Pennsylvania, my flight was late arriving in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I was dressed in my uniform, of course, and I was late getting there, and the guy at the ticket counter actually ran out to the plane. This was before jetways. You had to walk down steps to get to a plane or up steps. It was not as nice as it is today. And he ran out to the airfield and stopped the plane so that I could get on the plane to Johnstown so I could get there. Otherwise, I would have had to spend the night in Pittsburgh. And that was probably the nicest thing anybody did. And he said the only reason he did it was because he saw my ribbons and knew that I had served in Vietnam, which was nice, very nice.
Did you make any close friendships while you were in the service?
My husband. And 2 women I served with at the first hospital. We're still in touch today, although it took us 32 years to find each other again. We were back in touch, and they were older than I was when I was in on-K. I was very young, for one thing. I graduated from nursing school very young. I was only 20. So I went into the Army when I was very young. I was 21 when I went in the Army. And when I went to Vietnam, I was only 21, and that was very young for a nurse to go to Vietnam. And these other two women were a couple of years older than I was, and they kept me under their wing and helped me along.
What did you go on to do after the war? Did you follow any certain career path, or?
Well, I stayed in nursing for a while. I worked, I'm trying to remember where I worked. I worked in a hospital in Texas. Well, first I worked in a nursing home for about 3 months, and I didn't like that. And I worked in a hospital in Texas as the evening charge nurse for the hospital. And then where did we go from there? Then we moved to Alabama. My husband was in the military, you see, and we moved a lot. Then we moved to Anchorage, Alaska, and I worked there as a medical surgical nurse and in the recovery room. And from there we moved to Washington, the state of Washington. I worked in a nursing home again and went back to school. Then we moved to Germany, and I worked in a museum. Then I worked retail, and then I worked in a museum. And then we moved back to Kentucky, and I volunteered in a museum. Then we moved back to Germany, and I didn't work. And then we moved to Virginia, and I worked in a law library. I worked at very different things. And then when we moved to Missouri, I only did volunteer work, and I'm still volunteering, but I was appointed by Governor Holden 5 years ago to the Missouri Veterans Commission. And 2 years ago, or 1 year ago, Governor Blunt reappointed me to the commission. So I serve for veterans today, and we oversee 7 veteran nursing homes and 4 veteran cemeteries.
You mentioned that you went back to school. Was that supported by the GI Bill, or was that?
Yes, it was. I went back to school to take fluff classes that I didn't have a chance to take earlier.
How did your service overall, your service and experiences affect your life?
Oh, well, for the most part, my life has been affected very positively, but there are still some aspects that just still get very, very, have flashbacks, and my life is just affected that way. Just got to push them aside and not worry about them.
Did you feel that your husband being in the military also was that kind of a coping mechanism for both of you to have each other to relate to?
Well, since he remained on active duty, he had all of his friends to help him cope. And I just, because I was a nurse, I knew how to cope, but you just kind of, comes to a point where you can't cope anymore, so you have to seek help. So one does that when it's appropriate.
Do you still attend any reunions? I know you said you still keep in contact with some of the people, but do all the nurses get together at any time anymore?
There were about 20 of us who got together in 2003, and we're planning another one. The problem is with women who served in the military at that time, most of them served under their maiden name, and unless you stay in contact with someone, you don't have any way to get in touch with them, especially if you don't remember their maiden name, or even trying to track someone down. It's very difficult. The men have it easier.
Could you tell us a little bit about what you brought today?
Mm-hmm. This first item is our summer uniform. They were called cords, and I wore it to Vietnam and wore it back from Vietnam because I left in the spring when it was time to wear them, and I came back in August when it was still time that we could wear them. And it's a summer weight two-piece uniform. It's no longer used by the military. It's very comfy though. And the next uniform is my fatigues, my field uniform. We wore these every day in Vietnam. They were very hot. They're tropical weight, but they're very hot. We had to wear a t-shirt underneath, and we weren't allowed to take this part off, even though it might have been 110, 100. We had to wear them, but we could roll up the sleeves and have them rolled up. And it had places in the pockets, holes in the pockets, where we could put our scissors and other implements that we might need, forceps and stuff like that. We had a lot of pockets. And our boonie hats, well, this poor thing has been through the wars because it is really just faded. Partly due to the fact when my son was a little boy, he used to wear it. Put on my combat boots and this hat because he could wear them. And our dog tags, I don't know if we still have, I don't think we have this kind anymore. But they're metal. We had to wear those at all times. And on my dog tags, I happen to have a skull made out of ivory. It's carved for me by a Vietnamese man who was grateful because we took care of his newborn baby. Mm. And just a piece of ivory. I don't know what, probably from an elephant tusk. And on our hats, we wore our little pins, different units. Like this is from 27th Surgical Hospital. It was my unit pin. And then we had Snoopy pins versus stupid war. And I would have to wear rank in the front.
What were your job responsibilities as a first lieutenant? Like, how did that separate you from the rest of the field nurses? Like, did your rank?
No, because most of them outranked me.
Oh, really?
Because I was the youngest one in this hospital. They called me the baby. And I just found that out 3 years ago. I didn't know that I was the youngest one. And so what I did was I had to learn a lot. They knew a lot, and they taught me a lot. And our medics, our enlisted people they were really smart guys. They were really good workers, and we just loved them. They helped us so much. One night we had another time we had a mass casualty, and I got 25 wounded in, and it was just me and my medic, and I didn't even have time to call anybody to come help me. So when my head nurse came on the next morning, she was kind of put out with me, but there was nothing, I have no idea why the night supervisor didn't get anybody, but they didn't. And we managed to do everything we needed to do. But if it wasn't for our medics that worked with us, we would have had a really rough way to go. They really helped us a lot. These are Ho Chi Minh sandals. They're made out of tires.
Oh, wow.
They were made by the Vietnamese, North Vietnamese, Viet Cong, whoever. You could buy these on the economy and I got the Mama San to get me one. The Mama Sans were the ones who did our laundry for us. We paid like $10 a month and into this fund, and we had these maids that came in and cleaned our rooms. And yeah, well, if you would have seen our rooms, you would have wondered what they were cleaning. But the tires, these were made so that when the Viet Cong were walking down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, if you heard that, if they would wear these while they were walking on trails, then it made it appear as though they had heavy-duty equipment when they were just walking. And of course, you know, the Americans knew better, but they tried. And our rooms were maybe 8 by 6. It's smaller than your dorm rooms. I've been in your dorm, much smaller. And we had a cot, a dresser. I had a small, like a little tiny refrigerator. And it was covered with screen wire. The walls were just wood covered with screen wire to try to keep the bugs out. But one time I came home and there was something black laying on the floor, and I thought, oh, looks like underwear on the floor, and I went to pick it up. And it was a Kleenex being devoured by ants. Very nasty. I got bit one time by something and my hands swelled up like this. It was just awful.
Did you guys have like bathing facilities there that you could use on a regular basis, or was it like?
Well, we had,
especially being women, I didn't know.
Well, we had this little shower room. It had 2 showers, 4 toilets that usually didn't work too well, so we'd have to go out to the one-holer. And they had hot water prior to my arrival at that hospital. The week before I arrived, the hospital was attacked, and the Viet Cong blew up our water heater. So from that point on, it's cold water only. We managed to stay pretty clean, though. I mean, but I'm sure not by my standards today. Definitely, it was very difficult, and we had no makeup, no sanitary supplies, so we'd have to write back and get them from friends and parents, and you know, all that sort of thing. So it was kind of very primitive. And at the hospital, we didn't have any flush toilets. We had to use a one-holer, and when the Papa San, his duty was to pull the metal bucket out from underneath the hole and go burn the contents with gasoline or kerosene or diesel fuel, whatever he was burning it with. So if you were on there and he pulled that bucket out, you just yeah, it was different. You think about camping. Well, camping is much nicer than what this was.
Are those both from the tribal people?
Mm-hmm. This is one of their gongs, and this is a crossbow. The adults had, of course, very huge ones that they used to kill animals with, and this was a child's crossbow, where they learned. So they gave that to me.
Is there anything else that you would like to say about your service or your life after the service that you'd like to share?
Well, I met my husband while I was in Vietnam. We've been married now for 34 years. We have a son who's currently serving in the Army who just got back from Iraq yesterday.
Oh, wow.
So we are very thankful that he is alive and in one piece. He's actually in Germany. He lives in Germany. His unit is in Germany. He's active Army. And Actually, if it wasn't for the military, probably would not be in Missouri. This is not a place where I would have ever thought to live. And I wanted to show this blanket too. This is a blanket made by those tribes people. And the women sit and weave. That's their function, is to sit and weave and take care of crops. But what you see, like on National Geographic with the primitive peoples, that's the way they are. A lot of those tribes people have come to the United States and have settled in North Carolina and for some reason Wisconsin, of all places, where it's cold, you know, it's not hot there, but they're, any other questions?
Nope. I think that's it. Thank you very, very much. We
You're
really
welcome.
appreciate your time.